Contributions included the soulful While My Guitar Gently Weeps, for which he invited his close friend Eric Clapton to play lead guitar. Partly, it has been suggested, because he believed the other Beatles would behave better with an outsider present. By late 1968, Harrison had visited Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock, and what he found there, a communal, creatively free approach to making music, sharpened his sense of what was missing within the Beatles. When the Let It Be sessions began at Twickenham Studios in January 1969, the accumulated tension finally broke. On January 10th, Harrison quit the band, disillusioned with the studio atmosphere and the interpersonal dynamics that had come to define it. He returned 12 days later after the group agreed to move the project to Apple Studio and abandoned McCartney's plans for a return to live performances. Despite improved relations, the tension never fully dissolved. The recording of Abbey Road in 1969, however, did mark a turning point. Harrison contributed 2 songs that music historian Lavazzoli described as classics, Here Comes the Sun and Something. The latter, released as a double A-side with Come Together, topped charts across Canada, Australia, New Zealand, West Germany, and the United States. Frank Sinatra recorded it twice and called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. John Lennon declared it the best song on the album. For the first time, Harrison had achieved genuine songwriting equality within the Beatles. Of all the relationships within the Beatles, none was more layered than the one between George Harrison and Paul McCartney. They had met first as schoolboys on a bus, bonded over guitars, learned chord together, and grown up side by side. McCartney would affectionately refer to Harrison as his baby brother, but behind the warmth lay years of creative friction and suppressed resentment. McCartney's dominance in the studio was a persistent source of conflict. Harrison felt that McCartney's perfectionism and controlling nature often stifled his contributions. He recalled in particular the grueling recording sessions for Maxwell Silverhammer in 1969, describing it as a fruity song that they were made to labor over endlessly. Paul would always help along when you'd done his 10 songs, Harrison said. Then when he got round to doing one of my songs, he would help. It was silly. It was very selfish. In a 1974 interview, Harrison was even more direct about his musical preferences. I would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney. Paul is a fine bass player, but he's a bit overpowering at times. I would join a band with John Lennon any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney. But it's nothing personal. It's just from a musical point of view. In a 1974 BBC radio interview, Harrison went so far as to say that McCartney ruined me as a guitar player, a sharp indictment of the stifling effect he felt McCartney's dominance had on his development. And yet, he also acknowledged the deeper bond that persisted beneath the friction. I just know that whatever we've been through, there's always been something that's tied us together. McCartney, for his part, later admitted that he had underestimated Harrison's songwriting talents during their time together. In a 2020 interview with Howard Stern, he acknowledged, "It was easy to underestimate George because me and John had always written most of the stuff and had most of the singles, and George was a late bloomer as far as writing was concerned. He wasn't that interested in the beginning, but then he started to get interested, and boy, did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever." The acknowledgement, while generous, came decades too late to spare Harrison the years of frustration that had shaped his experience within the band. Even after the Beatles disbanded, McCartney and Harrison continued to orbit each other with a mix of affection and friction. In February 1994, the two joined Ringo Starr in what became known as the Threedles, working on unused John Lennon demos. Both admitted they continued to get on each other's nerves, though they pressed on regardless. When asked in a 2001 online chat whether McCartney annoyed him, Harrison responded philosophically, "Skin not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults. Then let his foibles pass." Old Victorian proverb. It was a response that captured Harrison perfectly, self-aware, a little wry, and ultimately forgiving. While the Harrison-McCartney tension attracted the most public attention, a perhaps deeper and less discussed wound existed in Harrison's relationship with John Lennon. The two had shared an early bond that predated the Beatles' fame, and Harrison genuinely admired Lennon's wit and creative brilliance. But Lennon's dismissive attitude toward Harrison's songwriting and his mockery of Harrison's spiritual pursuits left lasting scars. Lennon rarely took Harrison's composition seriously, and would belittle his devotion to Indian music and Eastern mysticism. Over time, Harrison grew bitter over the lack of respect and the emotional distance Lennon maintained. Their final interactions were frequently cold. Harrison later admitted in interviews that Lennon could be a difficult, self-centered person. In his memoir I, Me, Mine, Harrison barely mentioned Lennon at all, a conspicuous and telling silence that communicated more than any criticism could. Though Harrison mourned Lennon's death when he was shot in December 1980, he never softened his honest assessment of the wounds their relationship had left. Behind the peace signs in Beatles mythology, Harrison carried that grudge quietly, as he carried most things, but it never fully healed. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58, after a prolonged battle with throat cancer, lung cancer, and a brain tumor. In his final days, Paul McCartney visited him in a treatment facility outside New York. "We joked about things, just amusing, nutty stuff," McCartney recalled. "He was my baby brother, almost because I'd known him that long. We held hands." The day after Harrison's death, McCartney described him to Rep, the quiet Beatles' hidden fury, George Harrison's most complicated relationships. He was called the Quiet One, the spiritual soul of the Beatles. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney soaked up the spotlight and dominated headlines, George Harrison carved out his own identity in the shadow of the band's most celebrated partnership. But beneath that composed exterior simmered a deep-seated resentment, one that few saw coming and even fewer fully understood. To appreciate the full weight of that tension, you have to go back to where it all began. A Liverpool boy with music in his blood, George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943 at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool, the youngest of 4 children born to Harold and Louise Harrison. Harold worked as a bus conductor, while Louise, of Irish Catholic descent, worked as a shop assistant. Theirs was a modest household with no modern luxuries. The home had an outdoor toilet and a single coal fire for heating. But what the Harrison home lacked in comfort, it more than made up for in warmth and music. Louise Harrison had a deep, infectious passion for music. Her enthusiastic singing voice was known to rattle the windows. During her pregnancy with George, she tuned into Radio India broadcasts every Sunday, drawn to the mystical sounds of sitars and tablas. As biographer Joshua Green wrote, she hoped those exotic sounds would bring peace and calm to her unborn child. Whether or not it worked, the seeds of George's future musical obsessions may well have been planted before he even drew his first breath. In 1949, the family moved to a council house in Speke. George enrolled at Dovedale Primary School, later passing his 11-plus exam and attending Liverpool Institute High School for boys from 1954 to 1959. He was disappointed by the school's music program. No guitars, no rock and roll, just a stifling environment that did little to nurture his growing passion. His real education was happening elsewhere. In early 1956, while riding his bicycle, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifting from a nearby house, and something clicked. That moment lit a fire in him. He began dueling guitars in his school books, declaring openly that he was totally into guitars. At around 14, his mother Louise purchased him a second-hand guitar for £3.10, the equivalent of roughly £110 today, and a family friend taught him his first songs, Whispering, Sweet Sue, and Dinah. Inspired by skiffle pioneer Lonnie Donegan, Harrison formed a group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend named Arthur Kelly, and it was on a school bus during this period that he first encountered Paul McCartney, a meeting that would change the course of music history. Joining the Quarrymen, in March 1958, a 15-year-old George Harrison auditioned for the Quarrymen, John Lennon and Paul McCartney skiffle group, at Rory Storm's Morgue Skiffle Club. Lennon initially thought he was too young, but McCartney arranged a second audition on a Liverpool bus, where Harrison impressed Lennon by playing the lead guitar part of Raunchy, and that was that. He gradually became a full member of the group. Despite his father's wish that he continue his education, Harrison left school at 16 and briefly took up an electrician's apprenticeship at Blackler's department store. His real career, however, was just beginning. By 1960, the group, now called the Beatles, secured residencies at Hamburg clubs, including the Indra and Kaiserkeller. It was a formative period of musical growth, though Harrison's stay was cut short when he was deported for being underage and unable to legally work in nightclubs. By December 1961, Brian Epstein had stepped in as their manager, polishing their image and securing them a recording contract with EMI. Their debut single, Love Me Do, reached number 17 on the charts, and their first album, Please Please Me, launched a phenomenon the world would come to know as Beatlemania. The quiet Beatle finds his voice. George Harrison earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle during the Beatles' arrival in the United States in early 1964, when he was ill with strep throat and a fever. Advised to conserve his voice ahead of their landmark performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, his reserved demeanor became etched in the public's imagination. The nickname, coined by the press, amused Harrison himself, and it stuck for the rest of his life. But quiet did not mean passive. Harrison was quietly evolving as a musician and songwriter. He contributed lead vocals on the band's debut album, including Do You Want to Know a Secret? By their second album with the Beatles, he had earned 3 lead vocal credits and penned his first solo composition, Don't Bother Me. As the Beatles matured, so did Harrison's influence. By Rubber Soul in 1965, he was steering the band toward folk rock sounds inspired by Bob Dylan and the Byrds. It was also on that album that he introduced the sitar to Western popular music on Norwegian with This Bird Has Flown, a moment ethnomusicologist David Reck described as a respectful representation of Asian culture in pop. Harrison would later call Rubber Soul his favorite Beatles album. On Revolver in 1966, he opened the album with Taxman, contributed Love You To, featuring sitar and tabla, and earned the nickname the Maharaja of Raga Rock. By Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, his spiritual journey had deepened considerably. His composition, Within You Without You, featuring sitar and tambura, reflected his immersion in Eastern philosophy. He also insisted on depicting Eastern gurus on the iconic album cover, though he had mixed feelings about Sgt. Pepper. Calling it both a milestone and a burden, his fingerprints were all over it. The cracks begin to show. Behind the creative brilliance